Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Peace be upon all of you. My name is Farha Sayed, and I'm the policy officer for the Muslim Greens. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Muslim Greens, but we are a very new group within the Green Party, and we were officially affiliated in June 2024. So the aim of our group is that we represent and advocate for Muslims within the party and also outside of the party, as well as engaging parts of the electorate that will be disproportionately and are already being disproportionately affected by climate change and other social and class related issues. So I'd like to officially welcome everybody to our very first Muslim Greens online lecture series. Hopefully we will spend the rest of the month. We've got another 3 lectures to go where we will be looking at Islamophobia for this Islamophobia Awareness Month. We're going to be having a 30-minute lecture today, and it'll be followed by Q&A. So our chat is open. If you could direct your questions to Ekua in the chat, and she will collate the questions just in case there are repeat issues or questions which come up, and then I'll post them to our speaker. So now 3 weeks ago, I'll be very honest with everybody, I wasn't aware of Islamophobia Awareness Week, and looking back on it now, to be perfectly honest with you, I think it's absolutely the right time to have Islamophobia Awareness Week, because we have Kemi Badenoch as the Tory party leader, and we've got Donald Trump now as the leader of the apparently free world. So this is the right time to be doing this series, and I hope that as many people can join today as well as the next few lectures. So you may be asking yourself, why would I need to hear a lecture about Islamophobia, seeing as I'm not an Islamophobe? Well, the truth of the matter is, whenever there is a trend of oppressing a particular group, marginalizing them, demonizing them, and eventually criminalizing them, we see a trend of overall suppression of human rights across the whole society. And we can see that now with the use of anti-terror legislation being used against climate protesters and climate activists and other protesters as well. So we all need to really recognize when Islamophobia is taking place. Much like anti-Semitism, it has many facets and it presents in many ways. I hope this lecture series helps all of us, including myself, understand Islamophobia a little bit better and recognize it better. And unless we start recognizing it properly, then we can't really deal with it. Now, change always occurs when youth lead the movement. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker to the series, a very talented young scholar called Dawood Khan. He is a recent graduate in Middle Eastern Studies from the University of Exeter, and has worked with NGOs in North Africa, safeguarding religious freedom and fighting government corruption. Outside academia, he is formerly a professional fencer and a social media influencer with over 14,000 followers. So today he'll be discussing the portrayal of Middle Eastern women in Western media. So over to you, Dawood.
Thank you very much. I have a presentation planned, so let me just get it up now for everyone. Thank you for having me today. It isn't a blessing to be the first lecture of the series. But yeah, without further ado, I shall start. The first thing I want to say is this title does sound very long, but in its essence, it is just the case of scrutinizing Western media and specifically looking at the way that they have portrayed Middle Eastern women. I think this is very critical right now, especially looking at the time range of post 9/11. But before we get started, I'm going to say a little bit about myself, about me. There's a couple pictures there of me. So I am a recent graduate from the University of Exeter. I did Middle Eastern Studies, which is a pretty niche degree to do. A lot of people go into uni and they do history, English, economics, etc. But when I found out about this degree, I realized that I would rather follow and study something that I truly do have a passion in. And it hasn't let me down yet. I've come into lesson every time and I come away with something new and something that I'm really interested in. The picture on the right is from my most recent internship in Tunisia. This one was very interesting as it was something very new to me. I was looking at the religious freedoms of religious minorities in North Africa. So looking at Amazigh population, the Baha'i population, and kind of looking at how to increase their representation in government and basically protecting their religious freedoms. Um, Picture on the left, if you didn't know from the flag behind me, I'm very passionate about the Palestinian cause. I've pretty much been involved in like kind of third party involved in social agitation since I was young because of my family. Um, Kind of like involved in, let's say, like charity bake sales for Syria or just in kind of the circles where this stuff was discussed. And I think that is where my passion kind of grew from, because I did a lot of charity, let's say, events and did not know the reason why. And I guess now I'm delving into the reason why. Um, so before we get into the actual topic of media and women in the media, I think it's important we cover a few key pieces of information that lays the foundation for any kind of work we do on the Middle East. So the first and most important, I guess, foundational knowledge you need is the knowledge of Orientalism. I'm sure most of you have heard about Edward Said and his book Orientalism, um, a really key piece of literature that kind of changed the whole way that we look at any kind of information about the Middle East. So prior to Edward Said's book Orientalism referred to the study of Eastern languages and cultures. So just any European or Western work on the Middle East. After Said's book, he redefined it as essentially the biased Western depictions of the Orient and the depictions with the goal of justifying European imperial control, the management and domination of the Middle East, essentially. Um, and his work wasn't the first kind of critique of Western scholarship. There was pieces of work before that which attempt to do the same thing. But Said's work is so foundational and it's something that we all study. It's the first thing we study when we come into Middle Eastern studies because it systematically challenged kind of the entrenched like modes of understanding that we have towards the Middle East in our like kind of European educational system and Western educational system. I think it's important to quickly talk about Michael Foucault's concept of discourse because Edward Said drew from that a lot. So essentially, what this was is that the idea of truth is the idea of truth is created through discourse, and discourse is influenced by the dominant power structures of the time. So essentially, Orientalist truth, so kind of the truth that we are educated about towards the Middle East, is simply just a result of the Western superiority and domination that has manufactured and managed this kind of depiction that we have of the Middle East right now. So essentially, it asks us to challenge every notion that we have of the Middle East, from gender to race to culture, and kind of question why we have these kind of tenets of belief towards the area and the region. So there is critique of Edward Said's Orientalism. Kind of a lot of people said it's really broad. I mean, you can't really talk about the entire way that the Western world looks at the East and put it under one umbrella term. So there's other work that's gone into it. So James Clifford defines Orientalism in three key ways, and I like these. I like how it's split up because a lot of people kind of question what is Orientalism. So the first definition is Orientalism as any work of Orientalists. The second definition is Orientalism as a style of thought. So dichotomizing the East and the West, so creating kind of like a parallel between East and West, and also Orientalism as a corporate institution by which the Orient is managed. Um, so the next bullet point along binary thought construct. This relates to the second definition of Orientalism. So Orientalism dichotomizing East and West is, in my opinion, the most important and damaging form of Orientalism because it is simply looked at in a binary way. So you have these kind of tropes that are pushed on us through media, through literature, through art, from early 20th century. So we have the idea of civilized versus uncivilized, barbaric versus civilized. You have the idea of liberated versus oppressed, um, like agency versus lack of agency. And these kind of binary terms is a very damaging way to look at, is a very damaging way that we have been fed information about the Orient. Um, so yeah, another kind of critique of Orientalism is the demonization and kind of characterization of all Orientalist scholars as under one umbrella term of essentially racist and denouncing all of their work under one umbrella term. However, um, this criticism, I don't, for me, it doesn't really follow through because despite the fact that there isn't an umbrella Orientalist scholarship, there is the same tropes that we see throughout all of Orientalist work, in terms of like the exoticism and the again binary discourse that's used. The only criticism of Orientalism, the book, I would say, is its lack of conversation about gender. So it's very racially focused. Some may argue that is the more important focus. However, I think gender, after studying it, gender is as vital in Orientalism as race. We'll go on to speak about that. But obviously, this has been built on in contemporary work, but that is the criticism of Orientalism. Um, so the next important thing to discuss is feminist theory. I feel like this is pretty well known, but it is important to touch on it first before we go on to gender in Orientalism. So essentially, feminist theory is kind of the idea that societal relations between men and women can be characterized by a system of consistent patriarchal domination. So essentially, we live in a society where there is an entrenched systematic oppression of women. Um, and feminist theory appeared to highlight the fallacy of rooted gender identity. So the term woman as a social construct, rather it kind of challenges that and states that this gender identity is simply due to a repetition of acts over time rather than like a biological reality. But I think people do argue with that in terms of very controversial right now, whether that is gender a social construct or whatever. But I think the next point of feminism appeared in the 20th century as a liberating and emancipating force for women can't really be argued with. However, Western feminism and how it appeared can definitely be criticized, which is what we're going to go on to now. Um, so, the critique of feminist theory. Um, it is hard to critique feminism, but when you look at it through an Orientalist lens, you can see its failures and especially its failures to the third world. Shouldn't use that phrase, but its failures towards the Orient. Um, so the first criticism, it being limited due to its role in establishing colonial discourse, came about due to Western feminism came and kind of created this homogeneous representation of the struggles and the experiences of women. However, these struggles and experiences came from one perspective, and that was the Western white woman. And in this way, Western feminism appeared as a mouthpiece and a speaker and allowed itself to speak for third world women. Um, and a lot of scholars have criticized this and said that this allowed feminism to identify its relationship to the other, so allowed Western feminists to identify their relationship to the other third world women in hierarchical terms. So again, the binary of we have agency, you guys don't have agency, like uh, Middle Eastern women or Oriental women as passive and Western feminists as active. Again serve to inform the binary between East and West and perpetuate this damaging Orientalist information and literature. I think a great example of this is Mary Wollstonecraft, a very famous European feminist. She likened her own and women's own oppression to slavery. But at the same time as she was doing that, she was ignoring the Haitian Revolution, which happened at the same time, where female slaves played a critical and integral role. Another issue and critique of feminist theory is its lack of, I guess, care in terms of intersectionality. Quickly talk about intersectionality, I think it's critical these days to understand it, is just the idea that an individual occupies a position where they're exposed to various different forms of oppression rather than categorizing large groups uh, with one brush and in doing so fail to tackle actually deep-rooted social issues. I think a really good piece I read on this was uh, Francois Verges, who referred to this type of feminism as civilizational feminism, because he argued that it kind of perpetuates this domination of based on class, gender, and race. And he goes so far as to say that mainstream Western feminism was potentially racist because it focused on gender disparity while ignoring colonialism, slavery, and imperialism. I think we can definitely make that argument nowadays. I mean, you can see definitely the focus and care on the oppression of Middle East women in the Western world, like the hijab, the burqa ban. But then at the same time, we're looking at Middle East women in at Israeli checkpoints being stopped while pregnant, having to give birth at these checkpoints, refuse sanitary care, and even in Gaza, running out of actual sanitary items for themselves. And of course, the genocide going on right now, 70% being women and children. You can see that this is definitely a double standard in terms of what the focus is of Western feminism. But from this came decolonial feminism, which essentially offered a kind of like undressing of the failures of Western feminism and rather looking at everything through a lens of sexuality, race, and class, rather than divide them into mutually exclusive categories. So basically bringing intersectionality into feminism, and this is very closely linked to Orientalism, because in Western discourse we've seen often the use of gender to construct and manage and dominate the Orient. But decolonial feminism, and it's what I used in my dissertation, which I will be going on to talk about, kind of identifies, interrogates, and exposes these really harmful representations and stereotypes based on gender in the Middle East. So yeah, going on to gender in Orientalism. Sorry if this is getting a bit wordy, but I think this is really the most important uh, kind of information in terms of thinking about my actual research. So just to quickly touch on how the construction of gender Orientalism has changed. So pre-colonial images and literature about Middle Eastern women actually started off portraying them as like shrewish, harassing, nagging women. And then the same post-colonial depictions showed the same women as sexualized, submissive, oppressive, not oppressive, oppressed, exotic. So it was a very big switch. But this depiction that we see nowadays is has facilitated a whole range of new and very pertinent problems. So, for example, we can see the post 9/11 rhetoric. Um, I think this is probably the best example of gendered Orientalism. So we see how immediately after 9/11, the liberation and emancipation of Muslim and Middle Eastern women was used as an excuse in order to invade Iraq and Afghanistan. We see now what has it done to help emancipate, liberate women? Nothing. If you look at what actually was done to help women in those countries, nothing. However, obviously, um, Western feminism was used as a galvanizing influence in order to get the population behind um, neo-imperialism, neo-colonialism in the Middle East, and it was a very strong campaign um, from the US and the UK, kind of painting out the situation of women in those countries as so dire, and essentially pushing this whole concept of paternalistic the paternalistic Western world coming in and saving the oppressed Middle Eastern women. Um, which is another trope that we see very consistent. And it just allowed the rhetoric just allowed the Western imperialism to act kind of devoid of scrutinization. And we can see the damage that this has caused to those countries till this day, and the instability it's caused. I think the most important and kind of most interesting thing that I gained from learning about gender orientalism was the kind of shift. So you see in the 20th century, how right-wing ideology and power structures um, were very deterred by feminism. They were very anti-feminism because it opposed their entrenched kind of hierarchy. Um, but nowadays, the same right-wing institution, the same right-wing ideology is embracing feminism in order to promote their own colonial discourse and Orientalist rhetoric. It's interesting how when it can be used as a weapon and to promote their interests, um, all of a sudden it is a force for good and it's a given rather than prior when it was a nuisance. Um, I think the best example of that again is Palestinian women being stripped of their rights at Israeli checkpoints. But the West will continually condemn oppression in instances that serve their interests. But because Israel is a Western democracy in the Middle East, um, they're allowed to get away with it. Uh, I think another important thing is the burqa used as a symbol within gender Orientalism. It kind of is the symbol for uh, the oppressed Middle Eastern woman. I think it's the most galvanizing symbol right now. You can see it's banned in France. I think it was banned recently in Sweden. I'm not too sure. I think it was Sweden. But yeah, I think it is obviously the biggest symbol right now, which is I think because it's so alien to the Western world, it is very easily used in order to create this whole picture and facilitate honestly a lot of really dangerous things. And again, reinforces this whole, it always comes back to this binary construct of civilized versus not civilized, oppressed versus liberated. It only serves to reinforce that really dangerous mindset. Um, but yeah, moving on to my actual research that I did for my dissertation. I'm really excited to talk about this because I've not really had the chance. I always try to start speaking, everyone gets bored. So this will be my first time discussing my own research. So sorry, I did a media framing analysis. So I studied a case study of the Times London from 2001 post 9/11 to 2021. So exactly 2 decades. The reason why I did this is because I believe that the mass media currently right now is the most important tool which has been utilized in order to push Islamophobia, Orientalist rhetoric, and especially in terms of gender, Middle Eastern women have been used kind of as a tool in order to facilitate a lot of really damaging rhetoric, especially in post 9/11, obviously. So my case study was a review of all the articles concerning Middle Eastern women from the Times post 9/11. It was a lot of articles I had to go through. I used kind of like a news archive website, put my parameters in, put my filters in. So any article that actually mentioned Middle Eastern women at all came up in my search, and I had to kind of go through, read every single one. It was a tedious process, but I made my way through it. So let me quickly discuss where the limitations are, because obviously no amount of research is 100% foolproof, and I'm not going to say that mine was. Um, so first of all, equality. So I did a qualitative and quantitative analysis, and a qualitative analysis is obviously problematic because if you're basically that involves reading every article and coming up with your conclusions based on what you've read. If I've come into this with the idea that there will be a lot of Islamophobia and a lot of Orientalist rhetoric, then while I'm reading, I will kind of subconsciously be looking for that and maybe kind of lead my own findings. And the issue with a quantitative analysis is that it's points on a graph. You can't, especially when it comes to literature and perhaps looking at specific words or phrases that have been used, you can't really use it to make overarching conclusions or use it as empirical research. Another potential limitation is selection of articles. It came out to like 700 articles, and I had to choose the ones which are actually relevant because some of it was just like I put in the filter if it mentioned Middle Eastern women, and it would be like a Middle Eastern woman's perfume brand as the headline, which wasn't really relevant to my own research. But again, that is obviously subjective because perhaps another researcher might have found that relevant. The Times as a source, Rupert Murdoch. I think that one's self-explanatory. The Times was bought by Rupert Murdoch in 1981, I believe, and it became kind of a hardline right-wing paper, foreign policy, industrial relations. Um, Rupert Murdoch actually said himself that he wanted the paper to be a combination of right-wing republicanism and undiluted Thatcherism. So it could be the case where people say that it's not representative. However, I did my research and Rupert Murdoch has faced significant legal barriers to interfering in editorial independence. And also, if we look at the Times in terms of the scale of the major newspapers in the UK, a lot of most independent observers consider the Times to have a centre-right bias, which is the kind of places it in the middle and it's one of the top eight prevalent national newspapers, and it's kind of middling in terms of rhetoric. So I thought it was the best one to choose if I'm looking at Western media rhetoric. So that was my decision making. Right, let's get straight into the findings. First of all, we have the quantitative findings. I know this graph is quite difficult to just look at and understand straight away. I wanted to put like a description on the side, but I thought it would be better if I just explained it myself. So it's a quantitative analysis of the articles, showing at the bottom it's the year the article was published. So starting in September 2001, it goes all the way to September 2021. The lines represent the articles, but they differ based on sentiment. So I've split the articles into neutral, positive, and negative. So the orange line is the positive, the neutral ones are green, and the blue line is the negative articles. Um, so I'll give you an example of how I sorted it because again, a lot of people had different ways of seeing which one was positive, which was negative. So there was an article titled "Women in Kuwait Win the Vote After 40 Years." And I thought, well, that's a positive article because it focused on Middle Eastern women gaining suffrage, went against the kind of Orientalist rhetoric of them having no agency and being oppressed. So definitely I put that down as positive. On the other hand, there was an article titled "Women in Burqas Are Among a Dozen Arrested in Armed Raids." Negative. I think it's self-explanatory. And then there's an article just called "Afghan Women," which I highlighted as being neutral. And then if we look at the quantitative analysis, it's essentially the neutral article stayed pretty much uniform. That's the green line kind of at the bottom. It doesn't really rise too much. The positive and negative articles, there were a lot of fluctuations, but surprisingly, and this was where the surprise came, it was the number of positive articles actually outnumbered the number of negative articles in most of the years in the 2 decade range. This was all the years other than 2008 to 2014, where there was a spike in negative articles, but then that was the time of the Arab Springs. And obviously, the consequences of these revolutions kind of shook the world. So negative articles at that period was not surprising at all. But to be fair, I was really surprised. I thought that definitely in the earlier period post 9/11, there would be a lot of negative, damaging bias in terms of like sentiment towards Middle Eastern women. But surprisingly enough, there was more positive than negative. Which is why I concluded that I can't look at it quantitatively. I have to read every article and see what the contents actually are. And by doing that, I discovered four Orientalist tropes that were consistent pretty much throughout the whole range. And I ended up reading about 350 relevant articles. Right, so this is basically the meat of my findings. So the first kind of trope that was the most important, I believe, was the symbol of the veil as oppressive. That is the third bullet point down. I don't know why I didn't do it in order. But yeah, so that's the one that kind of jumped out at me straight away. Um, there were articles that like across throughout the range, even ones that didn't even talk about the burqa at all. One article described the burqa as a protection of male property and the erasure of the female self. Another article said it was a trendy fab which evoked understandable fear and negativity. And then, so those are obviously very forward kind of attacks against the burqa as a garment. However, the symbol of the veil itself was really interesting because there was an article which compared Iranian women moving towards equal rights as a sign that the veil continues to slip. And another article was titled, "The Rise of Islamists Draw a Veil Over Women's Hopes for a Fairer Future." So in these cases, it's not actually a direct kind of attack. Well, it's not a direct attack on the veil. The burqa is not directly referred to, but the veil as a word is utilized as a metaphor in order to create this kind of subconscious conflation between the veil and oppression. It's interesting because the veil was considered, obviously there is a lot of issue in terms of a forced application of the burqa, but originally it was a sign of respecting communities. A kind of this kind of rhetoric completely undermines that, depicts the burqa as the antithesis of women's emancipation, and it kind of just alienates, generalizes all Middle East women who wear it, like homogenizes them completely, and it just reaffirms like the gendered and racial oriented rhetoric of women being passive, don't have a choice of their own. And in terms of if we're describing women as that, then it implicitly posits Middle Eastern men as being the barbaric oppressors that we are meant to believe that they are. Again, so damaging because we see the results of it nowadays where you will look at an article and you're so desensitized to Middle Eastern male death now that in order, for example, me myself, I try to create a shock factor when I'm posting about the situation in Gaza right now, and I always find myself unable to posts that say anything about men dying because it is true that there's such desensitization about Middle Eastern men death because they've been portrayed as this barbaric, oppressive um, kind of race for so long that you have to go and you have to post about the women and children dying only. I think that's something that's jumped out at me recently a lot. Um, but yeah, continuing on the veil, it just undermines the agency of whoever choose to wear it. Of course, there is cases where people are forced to wear it, but then kind of this whole metaphor, creating the veil as a metaphor, undermines the agency completely of those who actually choose to wear it. Um, I think it is actually really interesting that a lot of decolonial feminism has actually um like portrayed the veil as representing like a resistance and a kind of like trying to subvert the dominance of Eurocentric norms of femininity. Um, that is just that's like scholarly opinion from some people. I can see it. I can definitely see that perspective as well. Um, but yeah, I mean that was a really big thing. There was another article I remember said that women chucking away the burqa um meant their move towards freedom. I guess this idea of um embracing Western culture and education, it kind of just posits the West as a moral authority and like the peak of civility. And then you have this whole binary opposition of, well, if that's the peak of civility, then obviously the Middle East is the opposite, backwards, regressive. Um, so that goes straight into the creation of the East and West dichotomy. Obviously, the veil is very important in that, um, because it is a symbol which is used to dichotomize East and West and civility and non-civility, unveiled, liberated Western women who are feminists and who have their rights compared to the veiled, oppressed Middle Eastern women. Yeah, the creation of this dichotomy is very damaging. It's a salient feature of Orientalist rhetoric, um, and it only serves to further alienate and entrench the alienation of the East. And I'm not sure if people know Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. It's a piece of literature that essentially stated that there will be global conflict, but it won't be nation versus nation. It will be on the fault lines of culture and civilizations, essentially saying that it will be the East versus West, and by East, Islam in general will be the problem, which is obviously a very extreme opinion to have, and for people who read it and who actually believe it, all of a sudden you believe that there is a West versus East kind of struggle continually, um, which I don't think serves to help any situation at all. Um, another another really important and salient like theme I saw throughout almost every article was the depiction of the West as a paternalistic force. Um, like we can see this through so many occasions. We can see where um, the West will posit itself as like a savior, it's coming in to save, it's coming in to help, it's coming in to rebuild, it's coming in to liberate. The best example I can give probably from my studies is the mandates of Iraq, the mandates of Palestine, the mandates of Syria. It was supposed to be the Western countries would come take control for a short amount of time until people gain independence and then leave. They realistically all they did was protect their colonial and imperial interests. With the situation of Palestine, could not have got it more wrong. Protected their imperial interests, protected their racial interests, and we have the situation in the Middle East that we do today. Um, Even to the point where the creation of Iraq as a country ended up being they just drew lines on a map the same way they carved up Africa. It was they put three warring tribes in one section of land without much care because again there was no care for the people there because they were seen as subhuman, which is where the Orientalist rhetoric came in. Um, but yeah, in more contemporary times, the portrayal of the West as a paternalistic force, well, obviously it allowed the invasion of Iraq, the invasion of Afghanistan, um, galvanized people behind the saving of Middle Eastern women. Not to repeat myself too much, I think there's one article that where Theresa May stated that she was doing a tour, I think, and she stated that her presence will inspire Saudi women. I mean, I don't really see Theresa May as an inspiring figure. That kind of arrogance comes only from one direction. Um, but yeah, so the final point is the depiction of the West. No, sorry, the depiction of Middle Eastern women as lacking agency. I've talked briefly about this already, but to give you some articles that I saw, it was articles like five women die in Tunis police raid, 47 women and children were found murdered. Yazidi leader begs Kurds to bomb women. Provided absolutely no agency to women involved, solely portrayed them as victims of war. Um, and we can see that in the period of the Arab Revolution, there were so many key female figures. The revolution in Egypt, the revolution in Tunisia, never brought up. It'd only be the cases in where they were victims of war. And there was a study on the victim industry, and it stated that victimization and labeling women as victims only encourages this perspective of passivity and essentially erodes their ability to gain control over their lives. And from this perspective, we can see how like perpetuating this idea that women are solely passive and oppressed only serves to further the instances of their oppression. And finally, I'm going to try to relate this case to the case of Gaza. I mean, I've touched on it prior. I'm not going to spend too long on this. Um, but here we see the failure of Western feminism, I think, in its core form. I mean, you have all these debates and about the rights of women in the Middle East, from the Khaliji countries to Iran and Afghanistan, where there certainly is huge problems. But as soon as it comes to the case of the women of Gaza, there's a blanket silence. There's no care about the thousands and thousands who have died, tens of thousands who have died, the ones who have been denied their rights for the last 76 years. We're not talking about just the last year. We're talking about having to give birth at checkpoints, being denied like care at hospitals. And these women are some of the most educated women of the Arab world as well. I think it was the Palestinians were some of the most literate or educated area in the world. Um, and at the same time, we have this lack of care afforded to women, but Western feminists has this idea that women are a homogenous group and kind of portray them under one blanket. Yet there is this lack of care towards the Palestinian women who have had to go through so much for the last 76 years. and have carried the community on their backs. Um, and that is simply due to the Israel being seen as the democratic and kind of civilized country in the Middle East. Um, yeah, I feel like as time has gone on, we can see where this is the truth of the matter, really. Um, but yeah, and that is all for me today. Thank you everyone for watching. Sorry if I rambled a bit too
No,
much, but
that was
I got a bit
brilliant.
carried away.
Thank you so much, though. That was an absolutely brilliant presentation and look at Orientalism and the way it's really affected our discourse on this in the West in terms of the media, as well as the way that we even think about ourselves. I mean, I'm a British-born Muslim, and the way in which we consume media and consume the way in which we're talked about by other people, it does have an effect on us. So it was absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much. But we've got lots of questions. So I'm looking at them. Which one shall I start with? Okay, I'll start with this one. Do you think is the eroticization of Oriental women the reason why the IDF are behaving in the way that they are, do you think?
Honestly, I don't think so. I think that is a indoctrination from birth. I think it is a strong nationalist spirit. I think it's genuinely due to the kind of depiction of Arabs in general, but Palestinians specifically as essentially human animals. I mean, we've seen in the last year multiple cases of actual Israeli politicians calling them human animals, calling for their genocide, and not really care for human life. I think the eroticization could I think that's more of a 20th late 20th century. I think nowadays it's more kind of the idea of them being passive and oppressed and needing saving. But in terms of the case of Israel, I think it's definitely just a desensitization to human life, and I don't think they see Arabs or Middle Eastern women as human in general. We can see that from their actions completely.
Okay, another question. Um, do we know for sure that the Afghan women are actually as unhappy as the media say currently? There may be a little bit of propaganda and unbalanced governance at play.
Definitely. I mean, I think that when it comes to the depiction of the state of or the condition of Middle Eastern women in other countries, you should take it with a pinch of salt. I mean, I was literally asked today, actually, a couple hours ago. Oh, I heard a story that Afghan women aren't actually allowed to speak in public anymore. What do you think? And I said that I'm not in a position where I have enough knowledge to confirm or deny, but you have the same kind of shock. That's the shock factor that we're talking about in terms of we had the same thing at the start after October 7th. We had the whole 40 babies have been beheaded. And it was the shock factor that like facilitated and allowed so much hate and damage to be done. I think that as a headline, women aren't allowed to speak in public. I think that could fall under the same category. I can't say for certain, but I wouldn't be surprised at all.
It's quite funny actually because obviously as a Muslim woman, I was concerned with that at the time as well. And you know, I like listening to podcasts and Rory Stewart, who was, I think, the governor of Kabul at one point after their invasion, he had chimed in on this, and he himself, you know, being knowing people in the region, having just been in Kabul and come back, he said that isn't the case on the ground at all.
Yeah.
Women are still going to college. Women are not wearing their burqas. You know, they are wearing hijab, but they're not covering their faces, and they're going about just as normal. And a lot of people, if they're not going out of their homes, they are having online lessons.
Yeah,
So I think it's not, as you say, it's not the black and white. There is nuance there, and we need to maybe kind of start moving away from, you know, taking everything as though it's absolute truth
definitely.
when you have those shocking headlines. Okay, let me look. Next question. Um, how should non-Muslims challenge gender inequality in Muslim communities then?
I think it's the case of education first and looking at things rather than looking at it in terms of like a blanket perspective, looking at it case by case. I think as soon as you deem it as kind of a religious issue, that is where you can easily fall into like like these damaging stereotypes. I think there definitely is cultural issues in communities, but I think look at it in terms of that and be very conscious of not like looking at community and painting them with one brush. I think the best way to look at it is a case by case scenario and challenge how you can in a sensitive way.
What's really interesting, I think, if you actually look back and you look at Muslims across the world, there are a lot of them from lots of different places. It tends to be where there was colonization, where there is cultural inequality between men and
Definitely, yeah.
women. Because I think traditional Muslim communities actually the women are very well educated and are on the same par as men. Um, okay. How do you think we can help to disassemble the negative bias towards Islam and its attitude towards women? Can we help to empower Muslim women in any way to do that?
I think the first step is education, definitely. I mean, a lot of these tropes and kind of like patterns that you see in terms of rhetoric, very easy to allow yourself to consume that without understanding generally the damaging side of it and how it can impact your subconscious thoughts, especially the whole idea of the metaphor of the veil being used so much. Um I think I think it is difficult in the society we're in right now, especially with the current like right-wing ideology that's kind of taken the country by storm. Um, I think the media has a big part to play. It's attaching emotions to problems and attaching communities to problems. But the only answer I have for that, because it's a very tough question. I mean, we're in a situation right now where all of this is very entrenched. I think it's education. Um, and from there we can progress.
Um, yeah, it's kind of the same question. So which aspect, I know this is quite a general question, which aspect of Islamophobia is the most important to tackle in the first instance?
I don't know how I would categorize different aspects of Islamophobia, to be honest. Um I think from where it stems, I wouldn't like split I wouldn't divide it into aspects from where it stems. I think the whole root of Islamophobia is ignorance itself. Ignorance and like a shifting of blame, I guess. Um I wouldn't split Islamophobia into aspects. I would say in general it's just a total ignorance and an understanding that the everything that you are fed and you are made to believe, um, there's a reason behind it. I mean, we saw what happened after the was it Southampton where the little girls were killed, and then straight away you see this
Southport.
whole wave
Southport,
of
yeah.
misinformation. Southport, that's it. I was in North Africa at the time, and I saw it, and I saw the misinformation that was spread everywhere. There was names being chucked out, Muslim names being chucked out, um, like countries of origins being chucked out. And as soon as you start to realize that this is a divisive tactic, that's when you'll be able to, like, I guess, move past the Islamophobia.
Yeah. So not all Muslim women are Middle Eastern or Oriental.
Of
Is
course,
there a
yeah.
different discourse around African Muslim women?
I think it is a very similar discourse. I think it's kind of the whole point of Orientalism is that you've kind of painted the entire Orient with one brush. I've focused on the Middle East here because I think that's where the most kind of known about conflicts happened. Obviously, post 9/11, it was Iraq, Afghanistan. That's where we saw this rhetoric in its essence. However, everything that is said there is directly affects all Muslim women across the globe. So everything that affects Middle Eastern women, the same stereotypes and the same tropes will be attributed to non-Middle Eastern Muslim women as well. Ones living in the UK, ones living in Europe, the ones who are living in Africa. It's the same with reverts as well. I mean, the whole idea of a Muslim woman being oppressed and being subjugated, as soon as let's say a Western lady puts on a hijab, the same tropes will be displayed about her as well, and all people have a subconscious thought that oh, she must have been like she must have been subjugated to do this, or she must have been brainwashed to do this. She can't have her own agency. And that's where it doesn't just refer to Middle Eastern women. Obviously, that was my focus, but I think it is an umbrella term.
You know, you read a lot of articles, and what would be interesting to know is that in all the negative articles, the generally negative articles, how many of them used Muslim women and the veil as a way of justifying their negative position. Um,
It was almost to an article that that happened, and it was in very subtle ways. So some of them actually did like a kind of like a storytelling kind of focus where they would like I remember one of them jumps out at me. That I remember it kind of created a little scene where two Middle Eastern women looked at a TV of a Western woman being able to dress how she liked and sighed and looked back at each other, basically creating this whole storyline and idea that they just want to be like the women in the Western world. They want to be that. They're not allowed to be that. Um, yeah, I think it is.
well,
I think
this is a really good.
the negative articles were not overt at all. It was the positive articles which had the little sprinklings of like little metaphors or they were overall positive, but had really damaging tropes inside, which are the ones that actually surprised me.
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. In much of the West, women are expected to dress in a certain way, a sexy way, or to look young. Surely the problem is the expectations of women and the judgments of choices that we make. If we're free to choose how we appear, then that is the opposite of oppression, surely.
I think in terms of um, a lot of people argue that the way women dress in the West as well is not freedom either, because you are constrained by, let's say, societal standards, like wearing a certain, like revealing a certain amount of skin, like wearing certain clothes that have just come out, stuff like that. People would refer to that as like being controlled by a certain societal ideology. My whole argument is if in the West we are allowed to, or we have this freedom, we're allowed to do whatever we want, why all of a sudden is it an issue when um, Middle Eastern women or Muslim women utilize their agency and wear their own religious garments? I think it is hypocrisy, and I think it is kind of trying to scrub out anything alien. And rather than allowing freedom, it's just promoting Western superiority.
Thank you so much, Dawood. That was
Well, thank
really,
you for
really
having me.
informative. And I'll be honest with you, I don't know very much about like the academic look at feminism. So it was really eye-opening for me. I know that there's some amazing feminists on here. I'm sure that they're visiting and they're really interested in what you had to say. But if you weren't able to listen to the whole talk, we will be putting them up on YouTube. And if you've got any further questions that you'd like to ask, then you know you can get in touch with us, and then we can put those questions separately to Dawood. I'm sorry if it's getting pretty late. It's almost 9 o'clock now. So before everybody goes, I'd just like to thank Dawood. That was absolutely brilliant.
Thank you for having me.
And
Also, I just want to say that if anyone's interested in the research that I did, I'm going to make my dissertation public, so I'll send that over to you if you wanted
thank you
to
so much.
share
That's
it anyway.
absolutely amazing. Um, so you'll be able to see that. Ah, brilliant, fantastic. So the next few lectures, next Tuesday, we have an amazing author. She's a journalist, and she's written a book called Muslim Women and Misogyny. And she will be giving a lecture on that and how we tackle that. And then on the Thursday, we're looking at institutions or individuals from a legal perspective. How should we be challenging Islamophobia? And then the final lecture, which is very interesting, which will be the week after next on the Thursday, will be Islamophobia and algorithms. And it's pretty scary what these guys can do now. So I really hope everybody who's visiting us for the first time will tune into these next lectures. And it's such a pleasure to have you all. And I really hope that you keep coming. Thank you ever so much. Thanks, everyone.